October 20th, 1944. 1000 hours. Red Beach, Leyte Gulf, Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur waded through waist-deep surf toward a beach he had abandoned 2.5 years earlier. The photograph would become iconic: five-star general, soaked trousers, determined stride toward redemption. But what the cameras didn't capture was the Japanese High Command's reaction when they learned MacArthur had actually returned. In Tokyo, senior officers who had laughed at his promise of return were now facing a strategic nightmare they had assured the emperor was impossible. The Americans, they had calculated, would never risk the treacherous Philippine waters. They had been catastrophically wrong. March 11, 1942. Corregidor Island, Manila Bay. Lieutenant General Douglas MacArthur stood in the Malinta Tunnel complex, 400 feet beneath the fortress island's rocky surface. Around him, the American defense of the Philippines was collapsing. Manila had fallen. Bataan was surrounded. His forces, 76,000 Filipino and American troops, were starving, diseased, and running out of ammunition. President Roosevelt's order had been explicit: MacArthur was to evacuate to Australia. The general initially refused, considering it abandonment of his men. But on the night of March 11, PT-41, commanded by Lieutenant John Bulkeley, carried MacArthur, his family, and key staff through Japanese naval blockades toward Mindanao, where B-17 bombers waited to complete the journey to Australia. Before departing, MacArthur issued a statement to the Philippine people that would echo through history: "I shall return." 3 words. A promise that seemed impossible given the strategic reality of March 1942. In Tokyo, Imperial General Headquarters received intelligence reports of MacArthur's escape within hours. The reaction, documented in captured Japanese military records, ranged from satisfaction to outright mockery. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, architect of Japan's Philippine defense strategy, reportedly told staff officers, "Let MacArthur make whatever promises comfort him. The Philippines are now part of the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. No American force will ever have the strength to return." The mathematics seemed to support Japanese confidence. By May 1942, Japan controlled an area stretching 7,000 miles from Burma to the Gilbert Islands. The Imperial Japanese Navy had demonstrated superiority at Pearl Harbor, sunk the British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse, and controlled the Western Pacific. American industrial capacity was still mobilizing. The U.S. Navy had been crippled at Pearl Harbor. Lieutenant General Masaharu Homma, who had conquered the Philippines, sent a message through neutral diplomatic channels that was intercepted by American intelligence. General MacArthur's dramatic declaration is noted: "Japanese forces will welcome any American attempt to return. The Philippine Islands are now permanently secured under imperial protection." The general's promise is the desperate statement of a defeated commander. In the Philippines, Japanese occupation authorities used MacArthur's promise as propaganda. They distributed leaflets showing a caricature of MacArthur fleeing while Filipino soldiers died. The text read, "The American general promised to return. He returned to safety in Australia while you face death. Japan is here to stay." Japanese strategic planning for 1942 to 1943 dismissed any realistic American return to the Philippines as impossible for at least 3 to 5 years. Staff studies presented to the Imperial War Council calculated that even if America rebuilt its naval power, the vast distances of the Pacific, combined with Japan's island fortress system, made offensive operations against the Philippines logistically impossible. The laughter in Tokyo's military headquarters would prove premature. MacArthur's promise wasn't just words, it was a commitment that would reshape American Pacific strategy and cost Japan an empire. June 1942. Imperial Naval Headquarters, Tokyo. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's staff presented their strategic assessment of American offensive capabilities to the Naval General Staff. The conclusion was definitive: any American return to the Philippines required naval supremacy that would take years to achieve. The numbers supported their confidence. Japan's combined fleet possessed 10 battleships, 6 fleet carriers, 4 light carriers, 38 cruisers, and 112 destroyers. The defensive perimeter stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, anchored by fortified islands at Truk, Rabaul, and Palau. Each base represented months of construction, airfields, naval facilities, supply dumps, and garrison forces. Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue, commanding 4th Fleet, calculated that the supply line from Hawaii to the Philippines covered 6,000 nautical miles. His staff study, captured after the war, concluded, American logistics cannot support offensive operations at this distance. Each mile of advance requires exponential increase in shipping, escorts, and supply bases. The mathematics of distance favor the defender. Japanese planners had studied American industrial capacity but underestimated its speed of expansion. They calculated that replacing losses from Pearl Harbor would require 18 to 24 months minimum. Constructing the escort carriers, amphibious vessels, and support ships needed for Philippine operations would take another 12 to 18 months. Their timeline suggested early 1945 at the absolute earliest for any American offensive capability reaching the Philippines. Lieutenant General Hideki Tojo, serving as both Prime Minister and Army Minister, presented this assessment to Emperor Hirohito in July 1942. The American general's promise to return is strategically impossible within any reasonable time frame. Our defensive positions grow stronger daily. By the time America possesses the capability to threaten the Philippines, our fortifications will be impregnable. But in Pearl Harbor, American planning was already underway. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, had received Roosevelt's directive, MacArthur must return to the Philippines. The promise had become political necessity. The question wasn't if, but how and when. The American approach would invalidate every Japanese calculation. Instead of building strength for a single massive assault, Nimitz and MacArthur would develop island hopping, bypassing strong Japanese positions, seizing weakly defended islands for airfields and bases, creating a supply chain that leapfrogged across the Pacific. Japanese intelligence detected American base construction at Espiritu Santo, Noumea, and Fiji throughout late 1942. Staff officers in Tokyo noted these developments but dismissed them as defensive preparations. The concept that these bases were stepping stones toward the Philippines seemed logistically absurd. Captain Yasuji Watanabe, operations officer for the Combined Fleet, wrote in his classified assessment of October 1942, American base construction in the South Pacific indicates defensive posture. The distances involved make offensive operations toward the Philippines impossible from these positions. We estimate American strategy focuses on holding Australia and Hawaii. MacArthur's return remains propaganda, not operational planning. The fundamental miscalculation was underestimating American industrial capacity and strategic innovation. While Japanese planners calculated based on conventional warfare logistics, American war production was achieving unprecedented output. In 1942 alone, U.S. shipyards would launch 3 fleet carriers, 24 escort carriers, and hundreds of amphibious vessels. The joke was about to become Japan's nightmare. August 7, 1942. 0615 hours. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The first American offensive of the Pacific War shattered Japanese assumptions about defensive security. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, commanding 8th Fleet, received the invasion report with disbelief. The Americans weren't supposed to have offensive capability yet. The Guadalcanal campaign would become Japan's first strategic education in American determination. What Tokyo had calculated as impossible, offensive operations 6,000 miles from American bases, was happening. The island's partially constructed airfield, intended to threaten Allied supply lines to Australia, instead became Henderson Field, an American base pointing directly at Rabaul. Japanese reinforcement efforts revealed critical flaws in their defensive calculations. The Tokyo Express destroyer runs, designed to reinforce Guadalcanal under cover of darkness, suffered mounting losses. Each destroyed transport carried not just troops and supplies, but pieces of Japan's strategic confidence. In Tokyo, the General Staff began revising their assessments. If Americans could sustain operations at Guadalcanal, Previously dismissed as logistically impossible, what else had they miscalculated? The November 1942 naval battle of Guadalcanal cost Japan 2 battleships, including Hai, one of the prestigious Congo class. These weren't replaceable losses. Lieutenant Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, operations officer for Southern Army, wrote in his December 1942 assessment, "The American offensive at Guadalcanal demonstrates capabilities we did not anticipate. Their logistics support unexpected. Industrial production exceeds estimates. Recommendation: reinforce Philippine defenses immediately." But Japan's resources were overstretched. Guadalcanal was consuming men, ships, and aircraft at unsustainable rates. The combined fleet, supposedly invincible, was bleeding strength in a grinding attrition battle. By February 1943, when Japan evacuated Guadalcanal, they had lost 24,000 troops, 38 ships, and 683 aircraft. MacArthur, commanding Southwest Pacific Area from Brisbane, was watching Japanese responses carefully. Each Japanese reinforcement to Guadalcanal was one less unit available for Philippine defense. Each ship sunk was one less obstacle to his return. The Solomon Islands campaign was, in effect, creating the conditions for his promise to become reality. The Japanese defensive perimeter was proving porous. American submarines, initially hampered by defective torpedoes, were beginning to devastate Japanese supply lines by mid-1943. The merchant fleet, essential for moving resources across Japan's empire, was suffering losses of 20 to 30 ships monthly. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, Chief of Operations for the Naval General Staff, presented a sobering assessment to the Navy Ministry in April 1943, "American industrial capacity exceeds all projections. Current loss rates unsustainable. If present trends continue, our defensive perimeter becomes untenable within 18 months. The Philippines, previously considered secure, may become vulnerable by late 1944. The laughter in Tokyo had stopped. MacArthur's promise, once dismissed as desperate propaganda, was beginning to look like legitimate strategic planning. Japanese commanders who had mocked the general's words were now frantically requesting reinforcements for Philippine defenses. But the reinforcements would never be adequate. American production had reached levels Japanese planners had considered impossible. In 1943 alone, U.S. shipyards launched 7 fleet carriers, 24 escort carriers, 128 destroyers, and hundreds of amphibious vessels. The industrial giant Japan had hoped to avoid was fully awake. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. November 1st, 1943. Empress Augusta Bay, Bougainville. The American advance was no longer creeping, it was leaping. Each new landing brought MacArthur's forces hundreds of miles closer to the Philippines, and Japanese commanders were discovering that their fortress strategy had a fatal flaw: you cannot defend everywhere. Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet had perfected the bypass strategy. Instead of assaulting heavily fortified Rabaul, American forces simply isolated it. By November 1943, 100,000 Japanese troops sat in Rabaul's massive fortifications, operationally irrelevant, cut off from the war. The defenders had supplies for months but no way to affect American operations. In Manila, Lieutenant General Shigenori Kuroda, commanding 14th Area Army responsible for Philippine defense, watched the strategic map with growing alarm. American forces had advanced from Guadalcanal to Bougainville in just 15 months. The Gilberts fell in November 1943. The Marshalls would clearly be next. Kuroda requested immediate reinforcements from Tokyo. The response, documented in captured Imperial Army communications, revealed Japan's impossible position: 14th Area Army will defend Philippines with existing forces. No reinforcements available. China campaign requires 620,000 troops. Burma operations require 180,000. Home Island defense requires 500,000. Combined fleet losses prevent naval reinforcement. Prepare defensive positions with available resources. The numbers were devastating. Kuroda commanded approximately 260,000 troops spread across 7,100 Philippine islands. Intelligence estimates suggested American invasion forces would number 500,000 or more, with overwhelming naval and air superiority. The mathematics of defense had become impossible. MacArthur's advance through New Guinea was equally relentless. His forces landed at Hollandia in April 1944, bypassing 40,000 Japanese troops at Wewak who would spend the rest of the war isolated and starving. The same pattern repeated at Wakta, Biak, and Nomfor. Each leap brought American airpower closer to Philippine targets. By June 1944, American bombers based in New Guinea could reach Mindanao. Japanese positions that had seemed secure in 1942 were now within range of daily air attacks. The defensive perimeter that was supposed to keep Americans thousands of miles away had collapsed to the Philippine doorstep. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, who would later command forces at Leyte Gulf, wrote in his June 1944 assessment, "The American advance invalidates all previous strategic calculations. Their logistics support operations at distances we calculated impossible. Their industrial production provides unlimited replacement of losses. Most concerning, they do not assault our strongest positions but bypass them, rendering months of fortification work irrelevant." The Japanese Navy had suffered irreplaceable losses. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 cost Japan 3 carriers and approximately 600 aircraft, including most of its experienced carrier pilots. American submarine warfare had sunk 500,000 tons of Japanese merchant shipping in the first half of 1944 alone, crippling logistics throughout the empire. In Tokyo, the inevitable conclusion was becoming clear. MacArthur would return to the Philippines. The only questions remaining were when and where. The promise that had provoked laughter in 1942 was now causing panic in 1944. July 26, 1944. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In Admiral Nimitz's headquarters, the debate that would determine Japan's fate reached its conclusion. 2 paths to Tokyo lay before American planners. Nimitz favored bypassing the Philippines entirely, striking directly at Formosa and then the Japanese home islands. MacArthur insisted on liberating the Philippines first, both for strategic reasons and to fulfill his promise. The arguments for bypassing the Philippines were substantial. Staff calculations showed the Formosa route would end the war 6 months earlier. It would avoid a massive land campaign across numerous Philippine islands. It would cut Japan's supply lines from the South Pacific without the cost of liberating every Philippine island. But MacArthur's counterarguments proved decisive. In his presentation to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, documented in military archives, he outlined the strategic and political necessities. The Philippines are American territory. 17 million Filipinos have suffered under Japanese occupation because we failed to defend them. To bypass them now would be a betrayal that destroys American credibility throughout Asia. Moreover, the Philippines provide bases closer to Japan than Formosa, with populations that will support our operations rather than resist them. President Roosevelt made the final decision on July 27, 1944. MacArthur would return to the Philippines. The target date, October 20, 1944. The landing site, Leyte Gulf, in the central Philippines. In Manila, Japanese intelligence detected the massive American buildup but couldn't determine the target with certainty. Would MacArthur strike Mindanao in the south? Luzon in the north? Or the Central Islands? Field Marshal Hisashi Terachi, commanding Southern Army, had to defend everywhere, which meant he could defend nowhere effectively. The Japanese response was Shogo, Victory Operation, a desperate plan to commit all remaining naval forces to decisive battle when the Americans landed. It was Japan's last chance to inflict such devastating losses that America might negotiate peace rather than continue the grinding advance toward Tokyo. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, the same officer who had laughed at MacArthur's promise in 1942, now commanded 1st Air Fleet in the Philippines. His September 1944 assessment to Naval General Staff was brutally honest: American material superiority is overwhelming. Conventional tactics cannot succeed. Recommend immediate implementation of special attack operations. The special attack operations were kamikaze tactics, suicide attacks by aircraft and later small boats. That Onishi, who had mocked American capabilities in 1942, was now recommending suicide tactics demonstrated how completely Japanese strategic calculations had collapsed. American forces assembled for the Philippines' liberation numbered 700 ships and 174,000 assault troops, with hundreds of thousands more to follow. The logistics that Japanese planners had calculated impossible in 1942 were now reality. Supply ships carried 235,000 tons of ammunition, fuel, and provisions. The armada stretched across miles of ocean. In Tokyo, the mood was grim. Prime Minister Kuniakai Koiso told the Diet in October 1944, "The Philippines will be the decisive battle. The empire's fate depends on victory there." But privately, senior officers knew the truth. They were facing an enemy whose industrial capacity and tactical innovation had exceeded every calculation. MacArthur's promise was about to be fulfilled, and the laughter had long since died. October 20, 1944. 0945 hours. Leyte Gulf, Philippines. The bombardment had been ongoing for hours. Battleships Texas, Pennsylvania, and Mississippi hurled 14-inch shells into Japanese positions along the Leyte shoreline. The noise was overwhelming, a continuous rolling thunder that could be heard 50 miles inland. At 1,000 hours, the first wave of landing craft hit Red Beach. The 24th Infantry Division and 1st Cavalry Division stormed ashore against lighter resistance than expected. Japanese strategy had changed. Instead of defending the beaches, General Tomoyuki Yamashita, now commanding 14th Area Army, had positioned forces inland, hoping to bleed the Americans in prolonged jungle warfare. But the moment that mattered wasn't the initial landing. At 1,300 hours, MacArthur's landing craft approached Red Beach. His staff had prepared a dry landing at a pier, but the general ordered the boat to the beach. He would wait ashore, fulfilling his promise exactly as Filipinos imagined it. The photographs captured MacArthur striding through knee-deep water, his distinctive cap and sunglasses marking him as unmistakable. Within hours, he stood at a radio microphone on the beach and delivered the message that echoed across the Philippines: "People of the Philippines, I have returned. By the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again on Philippine soil. Rally to me. Let the indomitable spirit of Bataan and Corregidor lead on. As the lines of battle roll forward to bring you within the zone of operations, rise and strike." In Manila, 550 miles northwest, the Japanese High Command received confirmation of MacArthur's landing location. The Shogo operation was activated immediately. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's carrier force would lure Halsey's Third Fleet north. Vice Admirals Takeo Kurita and Shoji Nishimura would bring battleship forces through San Bernardino and Surigao Straits to destroy the vulnerable American landing forces. It was Japan's most complex naval operation of the war, and its last chance to change the war's trajectory. But the plan required perfect coordination, and American forces were no longer the inexperienced Navy of 1942. They had evolved into the most powerful naval force in history. Filipino guerrillas, who had maintained resistance throughout the occupation, emerged from the jungles when they heard MacArthur had returned. Intelligence networks that had operated underground for 2 years began feeding American forces detailed information on Japanese positions. The promise of return had sustained Filipino resistance, its fulfillment unleashed it. Colonel Ruperto Canglian, commanding Leyte guerrilla forces, met with MacArthur's intelligence officers on October 21. His briefing, preserved in 6th Army records, provided locations of 16,000 Japanese troops on Leyte, their supply dumps, communication lines, and defensive positions. This intelligence, accumulated over years of occupation, gave Americans advantages Japanese commanders never anticipated. In the waters around Leyte, the largest naval battle in history was about to unfold. The Battle of Leyte Gulf would involve 200,000 personnel and 282 ships. It would cost Japan 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, effectively ending the Imperial Navy as a fighting force. MacArthur's return wasn't just symbolic. It was the beginning of Japan's endgame. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. October 23, 1944. 0632 hours. Palawan Passage, Philippines. American submarines USS Darter and USS Dace detected Vice Admiral Kurida's center force, the most powerful surface fleet Japan could still muster. 5 battleships, including the massive Yamato and Musashi, 12 cruisers, and 15 destroyers were steaming towards San Bernardino Strait, intending to fall upon MacArthur's invasion fleet at dawn on October 25. At 0632, Darter's torpedoes slammed into Kurida's flagship, heavy cruiser Otago. The admiral was forced to swim for his life as his command ship sank in 18 minutes. Darter then torpedoed heavy cruiser Takao, crippling it. Dace sank heavy cruiser Maya. Within 30 minutes, 3 of Japan's heavy cruisers were gone, and Kurita had lost his flagship and most of his communication equipment. But the center force pressed on. On October 24, American carrier aircraft found Kurita's force in the Sibuyan Sea. Wave after wave of dive bombers and torpedo planes attacked. The super battleship Musashi, designed to withstand any assault, absorbed an astounding 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb strikes before capsizing at 1935 hours. Over 1,000 of her crew went down with her. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, who had reorganized his command aboard battleship Yamato, faced a critical decision. His force had been savaged, but the mission remained: destroy the American invasion fleet. Against all rational calculation, he ordered the fleet to continue through San Bernardino Strait during the night of October 24. Meanwhile, Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet had taken the bait. Vice Admiral Ozawa's carrier force, deliberately weak to serve as bait, had been spotted north of Leyte. Halsey, believing Kurita's center force had been turned back, took his entire fleet north to destroy Ozawa's carriers. San Bernardino Strait was left unguarded. At 0658 hours on October 25, Kurita's force emerged from San Bernardino Strait and fell upon the escort carriers of Taffy 3, 6 small escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts under Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. The Americans were completely surprised. Japanese battleships and cruisers outgunned them catastrophically. What followed became legend. The destroyers USS Johnston, USS Hull, and USS Samuel B. Roberts charged directly at Kurita's battleships, launching desperate torpedo attacks. Commander Ernest Evans of Johnston closed to within 10,000 yards of the Japanese fleet before his ship was blown apart. The destroyer escorts followed, their small 5-inch guns firing at 18-inch gun battleships. The sacrifice bought time. Taffy 3's escort carriers launched every available aircraft, some armed only with depth charges designed for submarines. The pilots made repeated attacks, many making dry runs when ammunition was exhausted, forcing Japanese ships to maneuver defensively. At 0925 hours, inexplicably, Kurita ordered his fleet to withdraw. His force had sunk 1 escort carrier, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort, but the main invasion fleet remained untouched. Kurita, believing he faced Halsey's main fleet based on the ferocity of the defense, chose preservation over mission completion. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was over. Japan had committed nearly every operational warship and suffered catastrophic losses: 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, 11 destroyers, and approximately 12,500 sailors killed. The Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. In Tokyo, the Naval General Staff received the casualty reports in stunned silence. The fleet that was supposed to drive the Americans from Philippine waters had been annihilated. MacArthur's beachhead was secure. The promise made in defeat had been kept in overwhelming victory. Vice Admiral Onishi, who had laughed at MacArthur's words in 1942, now faced the bitter reality. On October 25, the first organized kamikaze attacks were launched, 19-year-old pilots flying to certain death because conventional tactics had failed completely. October 26, 1944. Tacloban, Leyte. MacArthur stood on the steps of the provincial capitol building as the Stars and Stripes was raised over the Philippines for the first time since 1942. Filipino President Sergio Osmeña stood beside him. The symbolic restoration of Commonwealth government was complete, but the brutal fighting had only begun. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commanding all Japanese forces in the Philippines, had made a fateful decision. He declared Leyte a delaying action and began concentrating his main forces on Luzon, particularly around Manila. It was sound strategy, preserve forces for the decisive battle, but it condemned the 65,000 troops on Leyte to fighting a battle they could not win. Lieutenant General Sosaku Suzuki, commanding 35th Army on Leyte, received contradicting orders. Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo demanded he hold Leyte at all costs. Yamashita ordered him to delay but preserve forces for withdrawal. Suzuki, caught between impossible demands, chose to fight. The result was a grinding campaign through Leyte's mountainous interior. American forces under Lieutenant General Walter Kruger's 6th Army pushed inland against determined Japanese resistance. Each ridge, each valley became a separate battle. The Japanese had learned lessons from previous defeats, they fought from prepared positions, conducted nighttime counterattacks, and made Americans pay for every yard. But the outcome was never in doubt. American artillery, air support, and logistics were overwhelming. The Japanese had no supply line, their reinforcement convoys were slaughtered by American aircraft and submarines. By November 1944, Japanese soldiers on Leyte were starving, eating tree bark and grass to survive. Filipino guerrillas proved decisive. Operating behind Japanese lines, they ambushed supply columns, assassinated officers, and provided intelligence that allowed Americans to anticipate every Japanese move. Colonel Kanglian's forces alone accounted for over 5,000 Japanese casualties through ambushes and raids. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was devastating. Soldiers who had been told in 1942 that Filipinos welcomed Japanese liberation now faced a population that hunted them mercilessly. Every civilian was a potential spy, every village a guerrilla base. The co-prosperity sphere propaganda had proven utterly false. In Tokyo, the implications of Leyte's fall extended beyond military defeat. The battle consumed 70,000 Japanese troops, killed, starved, or isolated. More critically, it consumed the last operational elements of the Imperial Navy. The supply line from the resource-rich Dutch East Indies to Japan was now permanently severed. Prime Minister Koiso addressed the Diet on November 15, 1944, his speech preserved in Japanese archives. The situation in the Philippines is severe. The empire faces its greatest crisis. The fighting spirit of our forces remains unbroken, but material circumstances are unfavorable. It was bureaucratic language for impending disaster. MacArthur's promise had proven more than words, it represented industrial capacity that Japan could not match. American forces on Leyte received 250,000 tons of supplies monthly. Japanese forces received nothing. American wounded were evacuated to hospital ships. Japanese wounded died in caves. American forces had air superiority. Japanese aircraft were shot down before reaching targets. By December 1944, organized Japanese resistance on Leyte was collapsing. Suzuki's headquarters, trapped in the mountains, was running out of food and ammunition. His final message to Yamashita, intercepted by American intelligence, was stark: "We have fought to the limit of human endurance. Starvation and disease have accomplished what American firepower could not. Request permission for surviving forces to attempt breakout to mountains. Further organized resistance impossible." The battle officially ended on December 31, 1944, though isolated Japanese soldiers would continue fighting, and dying, for months. Of the 65,000 Japanese troops committed to Leyte's defense, fewer than 5,000 survived. American casualties were 3,500 killed and 12,000 wounded, terrible numbers, but a fraction of what Japanese commanders had hoped to inflict. MacArthur's return was complete. The liberation of the Philippines was underway. The laughter in Tokyo had turned to ashes. January 9, 1945. Leyte Gulf, Luzon. MacArthur stood on the bridge of USS Boise as the largest amphibious force yet assembled in the Pacific approached Luzon's beaches. Over 850 ships carried 200,000 troops, the strike directly at Manila and the heart of Japanese power in the Philippines. The promise made in defeat was now being fulfilled in overwhelming force. The landing was virtually unopposed. Yamashita had abandoned the beaches, withdrawing his forces into the mountains for prolonged resistance. It was sound tactics but political disaster. Manila, the symbolic prize, lay open. MacArthur raced toward it with single-minded determination. February 3, 1945. American forces entered Manila's outskirts. What followed was urban warfare of unprecedented brutality. Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi, commanding Manila Naval Defense Force, ignored Yamashita's orders to evacuate. Instead, he turned the city into a fortress with 16,000 naval troops determined to fight to the death. The Battle of Manila lasted 32 days. Artillery and airstrikes reduced whole districts to rubble. The fighting was block by block, building by building. Over 100,000 Filipino civilians died in the crossfire and in massacres committed by Japanese forces. The Pearl of the Orient was systematically destroyed. On February 27, 1945, MacArthur presided over a ceremony at Malacañang Palace, restored as the seat of Philippine government. His voice breaking with emotion, he declared, "My country has kept the faith. Your capital city is liberated. The battle for its complete possession still goes on, but the end is in sight." Yamashita's mountain strongholds would hold out until the war's end in August 1945, tying down American forces but unable to affect the war's outcome. The general who had conquered Singapore in 1942 now presided over a slow-motion defeat in Philippine mountain caves. The strategic consequences of MacArthur's return were total. Japan's southern resource area, oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina, was permanently severed. The empire was strangling. Naval and merchant shipping losses meant even existing resources couldn't reach the home islands. In Tokyo, the government that had mocked MacArthur's promise in 1942 was collapsing. Prime Minister Koiso resigned in April 1945. His successor, Admiral Kantaro Suzuki, took office knowing his primary mission was finding a way to end the war. The Philippines' loss had made victory impossible, now survival itself was questionable. The psychological impact on Japan was profound. If the Americans could return to the Philippines against all strategic calculations, if they could destroy the combined fleet, if they could sustain operations across 7,000 miles of ocean, then the home islands themselves were not safe. MacArthur's promise, once dismissed as impossible, had proven that American will backed by industrial might could accomplish anything. For Filipinos, liberation came at terrible cost. Over 1 million Filipino civilians died during the war, many in the final battles of liberation. But MacArthur had kept his word. The American flag flew again over Manila. The Commonwealth government was restored. Independence, promised for 1946, would indeed come, delayed but not destroyed by Japanese occupation. The final irony belonged to those Japanese commanders who had laughed in 1942. Vice Admiral Onishi, architect of kamikaze tactics and mocker of MacArthur's promise, committed ritual suicide on August 16, 1945, leaving a note apologizing to the kamikaze pilots he had sent to their deaths. General Yamashita surrendered on September 2, 1945, in the mountains of northern Luzon, exactly where he had fought his delaying action. MacArthur's 3 words, "I shall return," had seemed the desperate promise of a defeated general. They became instead a prophecy of industrial age warfare's inexorable logic: superior resources, properly applied, ultimately determine victory. The Japanese had laughed at an impossible promise. The laughter died in the waters of Leyte Gulf, in Manila's burning streets, and finally in Tokyo Bay's surrender ceremony. The promise had been kept. The price had been paid. The lesson was written in fire across the Pacific: never underestimate a nation's industrial capacity married to absolute determination. MacArthur returned not just as a general, but as the personification of American power that Japan's military leaders had catastrophically miscalculated in 1942. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.